is Shelley Blanton-Stroud, and today I'm chatting with author Anne Da Vigo about her thriller, Bakersfield Boys Club. It's a thrilling novel about the abuse of power. It's, as Kirkus Reviews noted, it's unflinchingly realistic, but not without hope. And in particular, for me, it has a special interest because I grew up in Bakersfield, where the real world case continues to play out. And so that added kind of a personal level of commitment to this story, which is done so well. So, Anne, welcome. I'm so glad you can be here today.
Thank you so much, Shelley. And it's just like an honor to have you interview me after your terrific book, Coffee Boy.
Oh, thanks so much. If you could just tell us a little bit, for starters, about the real world Lords of Bakersfield case and, just a whole story that inspired your novel, Bakersfield Boys Club, and also your particular angle on that case from real life before you became a novelist.
The Lords of Bakersfield cases began in the late 1970s and continued up until the early 2000s. And it involved a group of very powerful men who were abusing vulnerable boys in the community of Bakersfield. The boys, and there were a series of murders. The men were murdered mostly by boys that they had abused. There was one murder that was never solved, that was of a girl who attended one of their sex and drugs parties. But the men were powerful guys. They were men, one was the police commissioner, one was the assistant DA, one was the man that hired me at the Bakersfield newspaper where I worked. One was a millionaire realtor and businessman. And so those murders began in the late 1980s, and I covered the trial as a journalist in the first of those cases. And while there was a student that was put on trial but never convicted, there was a 13-year-old boy in the background that apparently was at the scene, possibly at the time of the murder. And the boy, according to court testimony, was a prostitute. He was 13 at the time, and he had been put out as a prostitute by his mother. No one ever came to that boy's, rescue. He was put in a group home for stealing some money from the man who was murdered. And he went on in later years he continued to be abused by powerful men in Bakersfield and eventually murdered one of his abusers. Mm. I never forget that kid. I moved away. I became a journalist in Sacramento. But the memory of that case stuck with me. And finally, in the late, teens, I started on the book. The Lords of Bakersfield cases accumulated with the murder of the assistant district attorney, who was one of the abusers in the early 2000s. And at that point, the Bakersfield Californian finally wrote a huge expose on it that turned out to be a prize-winning series. So that's how I got interested in it, and it stuck with me for a long, long time before I wrote the book.
I even noticed that there are ongoing legal activities related to that case.
Yes, just last October. Well, the boy that I mentioned to you spent 38 years in prison for murdering one of his abusers. He got out of prison. It'll be 3 years this spring, and he just last October filed a huge suit against Kern County, the city of Bakersfield, and the San Felipe Boys Home, which was run by the Catholic Diocese of Fresno. And he was placed in that boys' home back when he was a teenager. And so, here we are 4 decades later, and the backwash from that is still happening. There's another case now in federal court involving one of the boys that was sentenced to a life in prison for a murder that he committed of one of the abusive men. And that one is also winding its way to the courts. I had a call from the federal defender's office about a month ago about that case. Mm-hmm. So the backwash from those cases is still happening today. And I think it's indicative of what does happen in abusive cases. If we're talking about the Catholic Church scandal, if we're talking about Epstein, if we're talking about other Hollywood figures and powerful political people, it doesn't just go away. Those things continue to affect not only the people involved, but also our society at large.
And I was wondering, as someone who comes from Bakersfield, wondering about how it was for you to continue to get information from sources in Bakersfield on this topic, particularly since so many people and families in power were at the heart of this story. Did you have difficulty finding out what you needed to find out? Were people willing to talk to you?
Well, this was a fictional piece, so a lot of it I made up. Mm-hmm. But I did talk to the attorney that represented the family of of the girl that was killed at one of those sex and drugs parties, and he was almost as puzzled by everyone else about who actually committed that murder. Mm-hmm. And why it was so pervasive in Bakersfield. So I think even he was puzzled by it. I talked to attorneys for various of the boys. It was sad. I mean, all those boys ended up in very bad circumstances. The boy that I mentioned to you, his real name is Robert Mistrial. And when he got out of prison, during his years in prison, he's been a drug addict and had a mental breakdown while he was in prison. And I did talk with Robert after he got out of prison. And at the time, he told me that he was going to be filing a suit in that case. So it ruined the lives of a lot of people. And it was sort of strange. I was on Facebook one day, and just about the only person mentioned in these cases that's still alive was someone that one of my friends knew on Facebook. It was just my heart kind of started to pound when I saw it. So what I did was for this book was to create a mother, a widow, and her son. And those two characters those were all, totally fictional characters, although some of the things I did pull in, but those two characters spanned the breadth of the years that those cases happened. I wanted to pull the time frame together a little bit more in order to make the book move faster, right? Which I did. So those characters and several other characters in the book were totally made up, and some of the characters were inspired by real people.
Right. I mean, I like to play in that particular sandbox myself, to find things that happened historically in the records and yet get inspired by them to make something new and fresh. And I'm kind of curious, why do you go about it this way? I know why I fictionalize historical events. Why do you, a journalist, find special freedom and opportunity in fictionalizing it rather than writing a nonfiction treatment of it?
Well, as a journalist, what you're doing is it's like just the facts, ma'am. And so you don't put in what the character is feeling, because that's not, the person you're interviewing is feeling, because that's not part of what you do as a journalist. But as a novelist, as a fiction writer, you're getting into their heads. You're trying to figure out what motivates them, what might happen even perhaps, which you certainly, you don't necessarily do as a journalist. But so you're looking at the whole person, not just the exterior facts, but what's going on internally. And so I think that's one of the fun things about writing fiction, but it took me a while as a journalist to get past that, say, okay, I really can say what it is they're thinking about. So I mean, it's been a really fun thing, but it was also something I had to get past, when I started writing fiction.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times people will report that studies are showing that reading is kind of an empathy machine. That when you're a reader, you grow better at understanding what other people feel and caring about what other people feel. And I think it's partly true of being a writer also, that if you're a novelist, your obligation is to convey who this person is, what these events feel like to them. And man, Anne, I really got that out of Bakersfield Boys Club, because I could scan through all of the newspaper articles all I want to get sort of the shape of real life events. But I wouldn't have, Suzanne Ricci and her son Danny in my mind the way they are. They become like fish hooks. They're stuck in me. Those two characters in particular, helping me to imagine the real harm that comes from such abuse of power. So the part that you fictionalize, you do a really amazing job of.
Thank you. It took a while for me to really kind of burrow into those two characters. And I rewrote the book a couple of times, that I had too many plot lines, and, I thought, oh, well, I'll do this and this. And I kind of had, okay, just kind of telescope it in, just focus on these two people, what's going on with these two people, and also with Pete, who is Suzanne's new love. And so those three characters, I tried to really kind of focus in on those. And the more I focused in on those, I think the better the book got. But it took me a while to figure out exactly where I was going to go with it, and, how I was going to really, get into the heads of those three people, especially Suzanne and Danny.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because when you have a world of facts at your fingertips, you have this whole universe available to you to research, because you turn first to historical or reported events. It can get overwhelming until you bracket it, until you decide these three threads are at the core of my story, and I don't have to report the whole world. I can focus here. And all of a sudden it seems doable, and also gives you strangely more freedom, no doubt.
It was a fun thing to do. And at that point, I did a lot of research, and probably you do too for your books. But for example, I researched the oil industry, because Suzanne, grew up in Taft, which is an oil town here in California. And it was a pretty wide open place back, in the early years of the oil industry. So I did do a lot of research on that, just because I wanted to know what it was like for Suzanne growing up. And I went to the oil museum in Taft, for example. So I did do that, but it was just so that I could get an idea of what it was like for her. And I did a bunch of research also on being gay back in those days, because it was different. It was very different then than it is now. It was sort of one of those things that you didn't talk about back then. But in the book, I have Danny and Suzanne go to San Francisco, just because Suzanne wants Danny to have a feeling for what it's like to be an openly gay person, and to have an openly gay life, which he couldn't in Bakersfield the way it was back in those days.
Right. And that is one of the reasons why readers who pick up Bakersfield Boys Club now are really going to attach to it. There's something about the loyalty and connection of the mother and the son, and her trying to find ways for him to feel redeemed and hopeful in such a bleak situation that he found himself in.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I have another question for you, which is, was there anything that you wanted to find out from the true crimes that you were never able to resolve? Is there a lingering question out there for you that you would love to have arrive in your inbox now?
Well, one of the things is a girl that was murdered back in those days. at one of the sex and drugs parties. There was never anyone was charged. Someone committed suicide. The police commissioner whose house the party was at committed suicide, but it wasn't clear as if he had an accomplice, if he was the one that actually did it, if someone else did it. And that was never resolved. And after I wrote the book, I had someone contacted me through Facebook Messenger and said, "Do you have any other facts about it?" And it was the sister of the dead girl's best friend. All these years later, wondering if I knew anything about it, and it was very poignant that this woman, who is now probably in her 60s, mm-hmm. is still wondering what happened to that girl. So that is one of the things that's unresolved. And the other thing is that the original murder that I covered, the man who was charged was not found guilty. And whether that person was guilty or whether someone else did it, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to me that no one ever stepped up for those boys. And that's something that's always been unresolved, and it's very sad. It was a sad thing.
That's a message you get throughout your whole novel, is that these are children, these are boys, and they're vulnerable, they are at risk, and who stepped up? That's a great point to raise.
When the boy that I mentioned to you who is a background figure in the trial that I covered, when he several years later killed one of his abusers, there was a trial in the case that was moved out of Bakersfield down to Riverside County. And at the time of his sentencing, he testified, and it's in the court records, naming the people that were involved. And no one ever followed up. No one ever brought any charges against those men. And so it was, and even he mentioned that he had mentioned to his probation officer that these men had done this, and she scolded him, for what she said was, "Well, you should stop using people, Robert." And that came out in court, and no one ever then stepped up. No one ever followed up to make sure that the boys, that came out of that boys' home, that came into the juvenile court, were protected. It was a sad thing, and those were in court records. So that's one of the ways I was able to use, people that, inspired me to write those characters.
It's interesting. I'm remembering now that when I read Bakersfield Boys Club, it was the first novel I read of the pandemic. And I saw that I posted an Amazon review. This was a great quarantine read. So interesting, well-written and touching too. And, and more came after that. But I realized I posted that on March 15th. So I was released from, teaching on campus, maybe March 13th. I picked up Bakersfield Boys Club that very day, read it, and it sort of stays in my mind in two ways. One is as my first pandemic read. So it's like, this is a weird thing. I have some time that I don't normally have, and now I can just delve into this book that I'm very eager about. But the other thing is that I want to let you know that there is a scene in the novel that takes place at a party in the backyard in the home of one of these men. And reading it, I was delivered back to the 1970s when I was in high school at West Bakersfield High School. And I recalled being at one of those parties in the backyard of that house, just because it was a place where all the high school kids were going to parties. You know, it was just full. It was like the Lost Boys kind of place in that backyard. And at the time, you know, I might have thought, you know, it's just another kegger or something. But honestly, my 17-year-old self felt very creeped out to be there. And while I was reading your book, I was kind of seeing that nighttime in that backyard with all those kids and then adults in the house. And it was interweaving. So your book got in there, and I'm afraid now, the way memory works, that some of the scenes in your novel are going to work their way into my memory, and I'm going to feel like I was there, but I wasn't. I am not a witness, anybody. I am not a witness.
Well, one of the interesting things right after the pandemic, and I did a Zoom meeting with a bunch of folks from Sacramento State University. They were all people who like to read books. And so I did kind of a discussion with them about Bakersfield Boys Club. And there were about maybe 70 people watching. One of them was a man who, as a boy, had been to one of those parties. And I just got goosebumps. He said that he was 12 at the time, and someone saved him, I think. I didn't ask him about his background, but he said that he never went to another one and he wasn't molested at the party. But I just got goosebumps that someone right there was someone who had been in that situation in the novel that I was writing about. It's like, ooh.
Yeah. May I ask you one more question, Anne?
Yeah.
This is one that a lot of authors don't like to answer. Are you working on something new?
Yeah. I have a new one that I have a first draft done. I'm working on the second draft. It's going rather slowly as I now that things are picking up a little bit. I'm doing more events for Bakersfield Boys Club, but I think it's going to probably take me another 6 months or so to do a revision on it. But it's getting there.
Good.
And it's a fun book. It's one that what I do, and maybe you do this as well, is that you hear things or you read about things and you think, gee, that would make a great mystery story. And I did hear something, that years and years ago about someone that everybody thought had died, and turned out he hadn't. And so the title of my new book is Presumed Dead. And what really happened. But it's been a fun book to write, but it's definitely a hot mess right now. And so, but it'll take some time. But I'm enjoying writing it. And anytime you do a book, doing research on it is super fun.
Yeah.
And this one was also super fun. So
I know that we have talked very briefly about the fact that your previous book, is it a gold thread? Is that right?
A thread of gold. Yeah.
You found out that I've been doing research on welders, and that you have done a lot of research on welders for that book. And I am a little embarrassed as I look around my desktop. There are all of these articles about 5 top ways to kill a welder. How will a welder die? What does it look like to die of electrocution? Can you electrocute somebody? So is the research fun? Yes, but FBI, please don't come calling. So
it is fun. And it is fun. I mean, that's one of the fun things I think about writing mysteries is you get to delve into some very interesting places. That's true. I mean, going to the oil museum at Taft, and it was like, whoa, that was very interesting. And you poke around in some interesting places when you're writing mysteries.
Well, one of the things that readers are going to love about this is that you get Bakersfield Boys Club is that they're going to get this historical stuff. They're going to get the setting. They're going to get the crime story. It really is a crime story. But also all of this comes through a sieve of your own consciousness. You're a gracious person. You have a feeling of empathy for your characters. So it never strikes a reader as being sensational or just gross for gross sake. It isn't that. It's very, very human and kind, but riveting. So congratulations on that wonderful work. And
Thank you very much. And it was great to talk to you.
great. And good luck with this draft. And I hope that 6 months is the period of time you want and get for it.
Thanks a lot, Shelley.
Best to you.